Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion on astrology, art, and adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore the current planetary alignments and offer insights for coping with change. Educational, informative, enlightening, the Turning of the Wheel is a welcome pause in your daily swirl of constant change. Through intelligent discourse, inspired guests, and educational segments, I will help to enlighten your knowledge of astrology and guide you to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Call in with your questions and speak with some of the greatest visionaries in the time-tested practice of astrology. Turning of the Wheel, Astrology, Art, and Adventure with Chris Flisher, each Thursday, live, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific, on Contact Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel. My name's Chris Flisher. This is a wonderful show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure, hosted on Contact Talk Radio nationwide and around the globe. And I got a great guest today. We're going to get to him very shortly. I wanted to make a few announcements beforehand. This is my 80th show, so I'm very happy about that. I've been on the radio here with Contact Talk Radio for about 2 years, I guess. Well, maybe a year and a half, something like that. I don't know. But anyway, I've got 80 shows that are on podcasts. They're up on iTunes, in the iTunes store. They're downloadable for free, and you can get them at any point in time that you want to get them up there. All you do is you go to the iTunes store. If you've got to load it on your computer, you enter my name, Chris Flisher, Flisher, in the browser there, and it'll bring you to my podcast, and you can just download them for free, however you want. To date, I've had 112,000 downloads, so I'm very excited about that. That's quite a milestone, and I hope to keep them coming, and let's see that number grow. So get out there and support this great show and these great guests that I have coming on. Today, my guest is Tad Mann. It's ironic because Tad was the first guest I had on this radio show about 2 years ago when I first opened my very first show on September the 13th of 2006, I believe it was, 2007. And so he was my very first guest, and he's a remarkable astrologer. He's probably one of the sources of metaphysics that you could possibly imagine, but astrology and his approach to astrology is incredibly unique. Today we're going to be talking about reincarnation. He has just completed a program for a website, www.tarot.com. That's TAROT.com. And it's a remarkable program about reincarnation and astrology. So we're going to have him on in a minute. I believe he's on hold right now, so let's get him on without any further waiting. Tad, are you there? Hello,
yes,
Tad.
I am.
Oh, there you are. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's great to have you on. I was just telling the audience about your new program, which is on tarot.com, TAROT.com, and it's about astrology and reincarnation. And I'm curious as to how you went about merging those two together.
Well, it's a long story because I had a strong sense about reincarnation when I began studying astrology back in the very early 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Just in the sense that it often felt to me, I was an architect before I did astrology, and for example, I grew up in New York State and went to Cornell University Architecture School, but when I first went to Italy for the first time in 1964, I walked around places like Florence and Rome, and I knew I'd been there before.
Yeah.
I just had this sense of recognizing the buildings, of feeling familiar with the landscape, and I'd never been anywhere like that before in my life. And so it was a very, very intriguing kind of process. And when I began doing the astrology, I developed a system called lifetime astrology, and the gist of it is that there's a kind of time scale in life, and the time scale basically describes a series of developments that start at conception and go through your birth and early childhood and so on. And when I was studying the early stages of development from, say, birth until about, 8 or 10 or 12 years old or more, I read some Jung and Freud, and basically Freud had a principle which is that when we in early life began learning how to read, for example, and to write and to speak, that it was equivalent to the time in history when humanity invented language. And that when we became more individualistic from 7 years old on, it was equivalent to the time in history when, individuals started emerging from the kind of mythological forefathers and mothers.
Yeah.
And so I began suddenly thinking that actually the signs of the zodiac not only describe these early developmental periods, but they must correspond to an equivalent time in history. So I kind of made a time scale that went back 50,000 years to the time when it's believed that humanity first became conscious. And when I graded all of this according to a logarithmic scale, which means that, you know, the early developmental stages like Aries, Taurus, Gemini take thousands of years, but as you get closer and closer to the present, everything develops more and more quickly. Population increases dramatically, all kinds of things like this. And what I discovered was that the signs of the zodiac are really embedded in these times in history. Like, for example, Taurus I associate with the time of the Earth Mother goddess cult. And in fact, Taurus has to do with the earth and domesticating animals. And actually between about 25,000 BC and 15,000 BC, that's exactly what humanity did. They had been nomadic. They settled down, began discovering agriculture. They started domesticating animals like dogs, for example. And so people who have planets in the sign Taurus basically have incarnations that happened at that particular time. And
so their characteristics are representative of the epoch of that era.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, if you have Saturn in Taurus, then it means that you were a wise old person at that time. If you have the moon in Taurus, it means that emotionally you lived in a kind of Earth Mother cult. If it was Mercury, then you think that way. So people who have Mercury in Taurus just naturally associate with the earth, with physical substance, with planting, with cooking, with all kinds of things like that. And to me, it was a very interesting explanation of how we actually link to our past, our collective past, and also how we actually connect to these various parts of ourselves. You know, it's a fascinating process. For example, to come closer to the present, the Sagittarius time that affected me is the time of the Renaissance, from about 1500 AD to 1720. And my ascendant registered around, I think, 1585, which is just before the time of Queen Elizabeth of England, and just around the time, just before Shakespeare. But what was interesting was that the architecture that I was most drawn to in Italy all was built between 1550 and 1600. And then when I began doing astrology some years after I stopped architecture, I realized that all of the magicians and astrologers and philosophers that I was drawn to, people like Giordano Bruno and John Dee and people like this, Robert Flood, that they were all around in the late 1500s. So it's the technique that I evolved, and it's evolved over the last 35 years, basically. The technique is fascinating because it actually identifies exactly when in history each planet in your horoscope registered.
Now, do you think that the sign of the person's birth represents a stage in their evolution? In other words, if I, being an Aries as myself, does that mean I'm a new beginner at this whole process and I've got to wait to become a Pisces before I evolve?
Well, in terms of the sun, I don't really, it tends to jump around rather than be a linear process.
I see.
Because here we are in this lifetime, and we all carry very, very different historical influences. I think it affects the languages we want to learn. It affects the kind of food we like to eat. It affects the places we like to travel to. In fact, I think that traveling to foreign countries is a way of exploring our historical past, our astrological reincarnative past.
Yeah, just traveling in general. I know that, yeah.
If you consider the connection to DNA and the genetic code, it's now pretty clear that we actually carry our entire collective past in every single cell. So to me, it's not really surprising that in fact these influences are very alive in certain of us. If we're really able to access this inner knowledge and inner life that we carry, it makes things so much richer and so much more powerful.
Yeah, it is truly phenomenal. And, the whole concept of conception being the starting point, I think that is very valid because, that really is when the soul is born, essentially, even though we haven't, gone through the whole gestation process and actually given birth. But at that moment is when the egg and the sperm join and the body begins to form. So it makes enormous sense, yeah.
Well, it's fascinating. One of the things which really connected with me emotionally was that I worked in Rome in 1968 as an architect, and some friends of mine lived near Campo di Fiori, which is the flower market just across the river from St. Peter's, the great cathedral. And,
right.
And it was a very powerful place because whenever I went there, I felt this sense of dread, even though it was an incredibly beautiful rooftop apartment, and my friends in those days were artists and actresses and models and things like this, and we had a gay old time constantly. But one of the days I went there, I actually walked around the square, and I couldn't see what it was that could have caused this. But I did see a statue in the square of someone I didn't really identify at the time. And it was only years later that I came across the works of this great Italian kind of heretic but also prolific author called Giordano Bruno.
Mm-hmm.
And Bruno always interested me. In fact, I realized I had been painting mandalas for years that were very similar in form to ones that Bruno published in his books in the 1570s, 1580s. Wow. I was really shocked by that. Well, then a friend of mine sent me a photograph of an old etching that showed that Giordano Bruno was actually burnt at the stake in Campo di Fiori in the year 1600.
Oh, wow.
So, and I'm not suggesting that I necessarily was Giordano Bruno, but I think it was really fascinating because I suddenly realized why I felt that sense of dread.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, I think...
Yeah, what about the concept of soul splitting? So even though perhaps you may not have been actually he in that situation, you may have been a portion of him. You may have experienced...
I may have been present. I may have known him at the time. I may have been Giordano Bruno at the time.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's interesting because when you have conjunctions in your horoscope, particularly close conjunctions, it may well mean that you had two incarnations that happened at around the same time. And of course, that can easily happen. And similarly, if I meet a woman who has Saturn in a particular position in Virgo, for example, and it's conjunct my Venus in Virgo, I correlate that 20-degree Virgo to about 200 years after Christ. It was the time when the Gnostics were dominant. And what's interesting about it is that the two of us would immediately connect with each other because we both incarnated at the same time. However, in that last incarnation, she was a Saturnine person, probably much older than I was, and probably a man. And since it was a Venus incarnation for me, I was most probably a woman.
Mm-hmm.
So what's interesting is that our relationship could easily have been, even though I'm a man and she's a woman in this lifetime, that at that time in the past, maybe in central France or something like this, that in fact she was the wise old man and I was the young woman.
Yeah.
So it's this kind of interesting and fun game to play. I'm writing this report for Tarot.com right now. It's going to be up and running in another few weeks. But, I'm immediately thinking about doing a kind of reincarnation partnership reading as well, because it's actually fascinating to see how you connect and when you connect with people that you're close to.
Now, when you're doing when you're writing this program, which is going to be, again, it'll be launched shortly, it'll be on Tarot.com, Tarot.com. Right. What is it that you're looking for specifically in a chart? So what kind of data will people be entering in order to get this type of report back?
Well, they would just enter their normal birth information because it's based on where the planets are in your birth chart.
Right. And so you will use any one point you'll use? Is there any one point that you will use to point to the historical piece of the chart? In other words, where are there any particular points in the chart that you look for to sort of uncover the past life?
Yeah, every planet.
Okay.
Every planet occurs, typically people's 10 planets occur in 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or even 10 different signs. So there are a whole series of influences throughout history that you carry. And in the same way that in a certain person's horoscope, Mars may be dominant, then your Mars incarnation might be dominant.
I see, yeah.
It's like you have Sun in Aries and I have Moon in Aries, and I've always thought emotionally that the Aries time is when humanity was nomadic, meaning everyone was traveling back and forth in front of the ice ages, which were still happening then. And in fact, I realized that my moon being in the sign Aries meant that I was a cave woman. And that it's funny because women I've been in relationship with have often remarked that, I seem to be very impulsive and very primitive emotionally.
See,
and of course, this would be very characteristic of that in the sense that it's like, at that time it was before nuclear relationships even existed.
Yeah. That's a good excuse, Ted. I think that's a very valid one. Do they usually buy that excuse?
No, I of course say it's tongue in cheek, but
yeah, got to kind of push that one.
But
yeah.
It is, and also what happens is that when you have aspects that connect one planet to another, similarly it connects one incarnation to another one. So our incarnations are linked by aspects in the same way that the planets in the birth chart are, and the more integrated your horoscope is, the more all these various incarnations kind of correlate and align with each other in history. It's a fascinating thing to study, I have to tell you.
Yeah. Do you think it's a continuum then, that the souls are continually recycled, and that you never, unless you reach nirvana and truly ascend?
I do, simply because the energy that we carry into life, when we die, it doesn't go anywhere. It keeps reverberating. Mm-hmm. They say a similar thing happens with radio, interestingly enough, given your program.
Well, the idea of radio waves being transmitted, you mean?
Well, radio waves don't disappear. They keep resonating through space.
Oh, well, yes, of course they do. They keep traveling, right, yeah.
They keep traveling forever, potentially. If you could basically take a device and go hundreds or thousands of years into the future, you could potentially pick up this radio broadcast.
Well, that is part of the plans of the SETI group. They're sending out radio signals in hopes that someone will be able to pick them up and send them back. So they don't lose they don't lose their power or their frequency over time. They just continue to move.
Right. And I happen to think, you know enough about my astrological ideas to know that one of the basic hypotheses that I make is that the DNA molecule is actually like a radio receiver, and that because it's spiral and because it's a spiral very much like the solar system is when it moves through time, mm-hmm. that we're always resonating with the solar system. We're resonating with that spiral energy. And as a result, we're able to pick up these frequencies that maybe are much slower frequencies but relate back to these earlier periods of time.
Yeah, since they don't disappear ever, that does make sense that they would have to still be there and have impact on us, which is very accurate in some respects, because you could see themes recurring through different lives that had been familiar to you in the past. Absolutely, I think that's true.
That's right. And I've tested it. I've tested the whole theory quite a lot with people who claim to have known their previous incarnations, and also people who are creative artists or musicians or novelists. And of course, novelists are like a perfect subject because especially historical novelists, because why did they write about one particular time rather than another?
Right.
A novelist like Thomas Mann, the great German novelist, actually wrote a number of novels that correspond exactly to the dating of planets in his birth chart.
Yeah, there's no coincidence there. Yeah, that's absolutely
to the extent.
phenomenal.
He's got Uranus in Gemini, Uranus in Leo that registers exactly at the time of Joseph and his brothers. The biblical story that's kind of legendary, and Uranus represents the kind of eccentric young individual in us. And Thomas Mann loved it. In fact, in the book, it was fascinating when I read it back in the 70s. In the book, Thomas Mann actually talks or describes a conversation between Joseph and his teacher, Eleazar. And Eleazar tells Joseph about his horoscope. but he does it using the Assyrian terms for the various planets, like Shamash is Saturn, and Nergal is Mars, and things like this. And what was fascinating was I immediately went out to a friend of mine who was a kind of scholar from Cambridge, and he basically translated the terms for me, and I therefore created Joseph's horoscope, which I looked at, using my time scale. And I looked at it continually as I read through the book, and I thought, this is fascinating because Joseph's life is actually very, very much like the horoscope. And then some months later, I came across the horoscope of Thomas Mann, and guess what the horoscope was? Exactly the same as Joseph's.
Wow,
so Thomas Mann actually gave Joseph in the book the same horoscope that he had in life.
Mm. Now, when you're talking about reincarnation, that is a fascinating point. When you're talking about reincarnation, you believe that this is a continuum and that we are continually going to be going through this cycle based on the sort of this natural evolution of mankind and this expansion that we all go through. And so as we go through the zodiac, do you believe or have theories about the idea of us as individuals? Do we traverse our way around the whole wheel of the zodiac each lifetime? Maybe so if you start out as an Aries, your next life is going to be a Taurus and then a Gemini?
Well, as I say, I do believe that we change, but I don't think it's linear like that.
Okay, right. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't go from A to B. It rather jumps around through history. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. I've read a lot of people who have theories about reincarnation. One of the more interesting is Rudolf Steiner.
Yeah. And
Steiner's work is interesting because he believed that we did actually incarnate, jumping around in history really based upon our spiritual aspiration at each time. Mm-hmm. So when you accumulate positive karma and, you fulfill very positive functions in your life, then there's a great tendency that in the next lifetime you're going to be born in a position where those kinds of qualities are going to become dominant. So, it's actually a very, very interesting process. I can't really claim to have any idea whether we actually incarnate in a particular sequence each time, but I just have a very strong feeling that that's the case.
It seems to be. Tad, we've got a guest a caller who would like to ask a question. I'm going to have her come on. She's calling from New Haven, Connecticut. Her name is Pat. Go ahead, Pat.
Hi, Chris and Tad. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
This is fascinating. I've got so many questions. I'm not really sure what to ask. I'm having a bit of a problem understanding. You seem to come up, Tad, with a particular time in history of reincarnation. I'm wondering if I could give you my date, if you could give feedback, or either that and my son. We're extremely close. We're both artists.
Mm-hmm. You know what I would recommend, Pat? I'd recommend, rather than using up airtime with your particular story, which is I'm sure is very valuable, I think it's best if you perhaps contact Tad offline, off the show, and then we are able to get more information about the topic. So if you could hang on afterwards or go to the website, you just do a Google on his name, you'll go right to his website. Right. Then you can set up a time with him personally and get some really valuable information.
Okay,
right now, you just won't get enough information in this short period of time.
All right, thanks a lot. It's a great program.
It's also very difficult because, you actually have to look at every planet in the horoscope to see.
Uh-huh.
If you're both artists, maybe the planet Venus is the planet that connects those, that connects you in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But usually it is possible to see what kind of influences you share with someone else, whether it's family or a lover or whatever. And it's very, very interesting because it often decodes the real core nature of that kind of relationship.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, thank you both very much. I'm enjoying the show.
That's great.
You're welcome.
Great. Okay. Thanks for calling in.
All right. Bye-bye.
The best way to do that for anybody here, the uncovering of the astrology chart, and especially the past life, is a very detailed, involved process that requires someone of enormous skill, which Tad clearly has. And so the best thing to do for anybody is to approach him through his website. It's atmann, MANN.net, www.atmann.net, N-E-T. And you can set up a time to have a reading with him, and I think you'll find it to be remarkable. I've done several of these with Tad over a couple of years now, and each time I'm always fascinated by the wealth of information and the robustness of what you can come out of with these charts. You'll begin to hear things that are just, jaw-dropping because of their frequency and because of their familiarity to you. So it's really important to do it that way. We're coming up on half past the hour. We're going to take a quick 2.5-minute break at the 30 past the hour. We've got a few seconds to go yet. My guest today is Tad Mann. He's he's an astrologer, he's an artist, he's an architect, he's a philosopher, and he's currently working on a program right now called Reincarnation Astrology, which will be featured on a website called www.tarot.com, Tarot.com. And what you'll be able to do in that particular situation is you'll be able to enter your birth information based on your date, time, and place, and presumably get back an extensive report, which we'll get back to.
Yeah, I think it's a 10 or 12 or 15-page report. It's pretty
good. So we're going to take a quick break for 2.5 minutes. We'll be right back, and we'll get more information about what we can actually see from this report that Tad's generating. So just hang in there. I'll be right back.
Dr. Doreen Virtue, and you're listening to Contact Talk Radio.
As the world shrinks and our barriers come down, diverse cultures are striving for harmony, balance, and peace. To ease the transition, we need to expand with color, light, and tolerance. Now, you can become a global citizen and embrace the color and clear spirit with the divine artwork of the mandala. Mandalas are a timeless artistic offering for creating unity, harmony, and peace. My name is Chris Flisher, and I've spent years creating mandalas, and they are now available online at www.chrisflisher.com. Come and experience the world of color, form, and function with T-shirts, coffee mugs, note cards, and limited edition prints. These vibrant, lively paintings and products express optimism, oneness, and spiritual balance for all who use them. At www.chrisflisher.com, www.chrisflisher.com, and enter a world of possibility and color.
Contact Talk Radio. It's on the internet. It's consciousness in action. Information. It's your connection to empowering information. It's what matters to you. It's on the internet. Contact Talk Radio. Listen live. Join in on the online chat. Contact Talk Radio. We're making a difference and leading the way at contacttalkradio.com.
What is your destiny? Where are you going? What is your real purpose? Do you know? Do you want to know? Of course you do. It's your duty to yourself. We are all here for a reason, and we all have great potential. Discover all of this and more with a professional astrology reading. My name is Chris Flisher, and I can help you. Discover your strengths and work on your weaknesses, and live your life to its fullest capacity. Based on your birthday, birthplace, and birth time, an authentic astrology reading will allow you to live your life to the fullest and reveal your true purpose. Only real astrology can give you real information. It is your destiny, and it is your path. Write me at chris@chrisflisher.com and book a reading today. Or call me, 978-264-0668. That's 978-264-0668. www.chrisflisher.com.
This is James Redfield, and you're listening to Contact Talk Radio.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My name's Chris Flisher. You're listening to Contact Talk Radio. This is a show about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. My guest today is Tad Mann. He's a wonderful philosopher, astrologer, architect, artist, and sort of what I would consider to be my mentor. Actually, he was my very first radio show guest when I launched the show about 80 programs ago. So I just went on to the iTunes podcast, and I realized that I had created 80 shows. I had no idea I'd done that much, but they're there for everybody who wants to look at them. All you do is you go to the iTunes store, do a search on my name, Chris Flisher, and all the shows are there, and you'll see the remarkable people I've had on as guests. So it's really it's phenomenal. So we're talking today about it's hard to live. 80 shows up there. I know. I don't know where the time has gone.
That's amazing.
I know where the money's gone. I'm not sure where the time's gone. But anyway, so we're talking today about reincarnation. And one of the fascinating concepts to me about reincarnation is that if we are, and I'm making some broad assumptions here, but I think they're fairly accurate, that we are a composite of events that have happened through centuries of time. Therefore, the idea would be similar to the idea of time itself, whereby the second that we're speaking at this right moment now contains all the information since the beginning of time. And the next second beyond that would be, where we can go with time going forward. So we do have free will with how we cooperate or operate with that next second, what we do with that next second. But the point I'm making is that every second prior to the one we just existed contains all the data and the information of time since of time immemorial. So that same concept, I think, exists with the human beings, in that we are born with what's called the collective subconscious, whereby we have information that has been passed down, so that we come into this world sort of like buying a computer at the store, where it comes preloaded with programs. And I'm curious, Tad, what you think about this concept of the collective subconscious. And I've always used this example of you might think that, well, a baby born 100 years ago probably wouldn't know the first thing about what to do with a computer mouse. But a baby born today would probably know about that and respond to that very quickly. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I think that I agree with much of what you're saying. I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but what I do think is the case is that certainly we carry, a huge amount of information, and I do certainly agree with the idea of a collective unconscious. In fact, in my lifetime astrology system, the collective unconscious is basically the time of gestation, because from the time we're conceived until we're born, every single one of us repeats the entire evolutionary process in the womb within our mother. And, of course, that entire process is something that we all share. We all have it in common. And so, as a result, the idea is that some people, as they grow up, it's commonly known that when kids are very young, they're still very much in contact to that, previous stream of existences. And when they reach around the age of 6 or 7 or 8 years old, we begin basically to forget. And in a sense, it's almost as though people who are clairvoyant or people who have a very strong kind of psychic sense are people who are able to go back into a childhood state. And when they go back into that state, the boundaries and the barriers that separate us from this collective unconscious become permeable and open, and we can therefore essentially step back into the past. And I believe that this process actually happens, and I think that something like this reincarnation report, at least in my experience, often kind of triggers that kind of realization and a remembrance. And, when it happens, you kind of wonder whether it's a memory, whether it's a collective process or whatever. But I think, people like Edgar Cayce talked about something he called the Akashic Record.
Right.
Which was, when you read his books, it's often a little bit confusing because he makes it sound like the Akashic Record is some kind of great library in the sky that floats over your head.
Yes.
But I suddenly realize, actually, that Akashic Record is in every cell. It's actually that spiraling solar system that I mentioned before, which is the source of our kind of genetic memory. So I think we do have a collective unconscious. I think that everyone has it, meaning that everyone has a kind of internal library of profound wisdom if we only realize how to gain access to it. So the real
how
trick...
would you suggest doing that? How would we gain access to that? Is it through hypnosis?
Well, I think meditation is one route.
Mm-hmm.
I think back in the 70s or 60s or 70s that a lot of people took various strange substances as a way of trying to get back to that place. Certainly there was a distinct kind of sense of time warp when one explored such substances. And I think also that there are a lot of spiritual techniques that encourage that to happen. So I think it's something that's really available to us if we really have the interest to go there, and that it can produce really profound experiences. Cayce did it when he was hypnotized.
Right.
And it was as though he could see into the past. He could see back into these earlier periods of time. And I think almost everyone has the capacity to do that. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I think that the ability to tap into that is, I think it happens to me when you're sort of in that dreamlike state between consciousness and unconsciousness. And,
right, exactly.
Where you're tapping into a different frequency.
I think the dreams are like a playing out of previous incarnations, except very much like the reincarnation time scale, all of these incarnations are jumbled.
Mm-hmm.
Because unless we go back and explore each one and try to discover exactly which memories correspond to which lifetime, then we're going to end up getting a kind of jumbled history inside. And that, to me, is very, very close to the way I feel about dreams, for example. I feel like it's a series of different time periods.
Yeah. What do you think people will gain from learning this past? Will there be this moment of aha, this bell going off like, oh my gosh, this is where I've been? Or would you think you'd be able to provide them with the type of information that says, for example, well, perhaps you'd be happier living in a different type of environment or a different part of the world because we can sort of see that you did pretty well at that time? Would you give that sort of guidance?
You might make conclusions like that, but I try not to make such conclusions. If someone comes to that realization themselves, that's fine. But I do think that it actually tells you things that can be very important. I mean, I thought that this kind of knowledge is important enough to have lived in Europe for 30 years of my life. I loved living there because something in me resonated with Europe in a way that, although I love America in some ways, it doesn't resonate in the same way that Europe does. But of course, my ancestors came here relatively recently in history, which is only 200 or 300 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that we may have spent 20 or 30 or 40 or 60 or 100 centuries in Europe, each of us. So the idea is that we actually carry this very, very deep history. And I'm not saying that I can teach someone how to understand their past, but certainly I think the first step is to start decoding this life and to really see what actually arises when you explore these previous times.
Do you think that the interest people have, the hobbies people have, the sort of their inclination towards certain jobs and abilities and talents, is loaded with this, or is part of the same process, or is part of the same information?
I think it could easily be. I think, for example, say to someone who has, look at Picasso, for example, who has a lot of planets in Taurus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Picasso is a Taurus, and what's interesting about Picasso is that the figurines that he loved drawing, were women with gigantic hips and breasts, and they look actually like Earth mothers.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not surprising that Picasso has about 4 planets in Taurus that register 20,000 years ago when people were making cave paintings of women that look exactly like that. So I would say that Picasso, in his art, is actually remembering a previous lifetime when he lived at a time when the desirable view of human femininity was a very muscular, strong, powerful woman.
Yeah, sort of Rubenesque. Yeah. It's interesting that those strains of familiarity would be there. Now, the whole concept of déjà vu, of course, enters into this very strongly because this is where we have that moment of recognition of having been someplace. I agree. I've clearly had those situations in my own life. Now, I did a past life regression. A past life regression is it's a process you go through with a trained specialist who sort of gets you into a semi-hypnotic state and takes you back through your time and to you hopefully arrive at some of your past lives. I did that once, and I got back as far as about the early 1800s when I was actually involved as a rebel spy in the Civil War, and I was a musician at one point in time as a slave on a plantation in Mississippi. All of that rang very true, and then when I went down to Mississippi, I had goosebumps. I mean, it was just way so familiar to me to be able to be in that situation. And I think we've all had that. So the concept of reincarnation is very real. And I think in some ways, I'm sort of excited by that. I'm sort of encouraged by that because, we all fear the idea of death. And I think that if we know there's something else coming out, there's another act involved in this, there's a stay tuned for the next episode. It gives us a sense of not fearing that so much, but perhaps a sense of adventure and learning and evolution and growing and evolving.
I agree. It's a question of embracing it. It's like I find myself being a little bit sad because people I know who are young these days don't really have the same. They aren't really encouraged to learn about history in the same way that I was when I was a kid. I was something called a special history scholar when I was in high school in upstate New York, and as a result, I studied American history on Saturdays. I mixed it in with my baseball practice and so on. But, the whole idea being that when we understand history and really connect with how rich it is, then it really does feel like you can much more kind of sensibly navigate through time in the past and so on. And I actually think of that as being really a great adventure. And
I do too.
The opportunity to really approach the world and approach life in a very, very different and quite profound way.
Yeah, the information that you derive from history is so rich because you begin to see the patterns and the cycles begin to recur, and they happen at certain moments and times, and you can begin to see this evolution. It's only when we look backward that we really see what's learned, and we need what we've learned, and we need to have a significant amount of distance between us in order to fully digest that and process it to a point where it has some value.
Well, absolutely. I mean, when I lived in Europe, my whole family used to go to Greece every summer. And one of the things I loved about it was that, everyone knows the kind of Greek myths and how exotic they are and how strange and interesting it all is. Well, I discovered, actually, that when you're in Greece, your dreams are like Greek myths. And it was really terrific going there because, in a way, it was like deriving an inspiration for an entire year in advance to go there for just a couple of months, just because it was as though this unconscious energy went back into history, and it was just fascinating.
Now, why do you think that certain religions don't condone the idea of reincarnation? Is it sort of a...
well, it was a part of Christianity until the Council of Nicaea in 325 A.D., when both astrology and reincarnation ideas were eliminated from traditional Christianity. There's a feeling among some scholars that the whole idea of the rebirth of Jesus Christ and so on was originally a reincarnation mechanism.
It's interesting why they would try to quell that.
Well, because it was the earthly fathers. They were trying to create like a patriarchal religion, and they were trying to eliminate the earlier Gnostic ideas that basically were the foundation of early Christianity, which were that the soul is eternal in the way that you and I were just talking about it.
Yeah.
If you believe that you come back, I think it actually encourages a different kind of ecological awareness, even because if you're not ever coming back, then it doesn't matter if you trash the earth. But if you are, then it really does make a huge difference.
That's right. You're going to be back at this campground again sometime, so you better leave it clean.
That's right. So you better clean up after yourself this time.
That's right. We all probably, many of my listeners, I'm sure, know of the book Many Lives, Many Masters, which was written by Brian Weiss. He was a famous psychologist, and I'm sure he still is a famous psychologist, who did quite a bit of work with this whole past life regressions. And the reason it's interesting to me is because it directly dovetails with this topic of reincarnation, because in his book he has one particular client who totally changed her life as a result of understanding where she came from. She was sort of living demons that she had inherited, centuries ago, and was able to sort of process that in a modern-day setting. And I'm just curious what you feel about that and that whole concept. I mean, it really is fascinating. Have you read the book? Are you familiar with it?
I read it a long, long time ago. But which concept are you talking about then?
Well, the idea of being able to. She was a woman who was haunted by a number of different things. She had a number of different personality disorders, and because of doing a past life regression, he was able to get her back to a spot where she was able to understand it, and then by doing that, she was able to process her existence today,
right?
By knowing where she came from. And so it didn't haunt her in the same way as it had then. In other words, she would have recurring...
I think things like that work. There was a doctor in England I knew back in the 70s called Arthur Girdham, and he wrote a book called Cathars and Reincarnation. And, he actually did reincarnation therapy with his patients and found that it was remarkably effective because, if you think about it, what would happen if you had an incarnation that would come up to you in your dreams, for example, that was so vivid and so real that it was more interesting than your day-to-day life? you might well choose, and it would be pathological, of course, but you might well choose to kind of go there completely, to identify with it altogether, and therefore leave the present time. And I think that's entirely reasonable as an idea, and I'm sure people do it.
Yeah, I wonder if certain kinds of artists have more of an inclination to this. Now, you mentioned novelists beforehand. I'm also thinking of actors, because actors could easily be playing a role.
Oh, definitely.
You know?
No, it's true of actors. It's true of, like Verdi, the great Italian opera composer,
Right.
had a lot of planets in Leo that correspond exactly to the time of his opera Aida. And Robert Graves, the poet, did lots of explorations of, he wrote a wonderful novel called I, Claudius, about a very early Roman emperor, one of the first Roman emperors. And, Robert Graves has a ton of planets in early Virgo registering at that time. I think it affects artists, it affects actors and actresses, it affects musicians, it affects all kinds of people. Of course,
in theory, it should affect everyone. I guess it's just how it manifests itself in the daily, in the reborn life is how it really manifests.
Yeah, it depends on how conscious or unconscious they happen to be. The more mechanical, the less in touch with the kind of inner spiritual core a person is, the less likely they are to really be resonating with these very deep kind of inner energies. And of course,
you really have to. Yeah, you've got to have your antenna up for sure. Now, what about the concept of a sense of predestiny? How does predestiny sort of map into this whole idea of reincarnation? Because if you think of reincarnation as being a continuum of an expansion of a soul, you would think that predestiny would also be involved in that.
Well, I think to a certain extent that could easily be the case. I think that, when people are unconscious for life after life, I think they keep becoming more and more unconscious from lifetime to lifetime, and therefore probably repeat the same processes over and over again.
Right, because their antenna's not up, because they're not thinking about it, because they're not evolving, and they're not gathering the information which would carry them into the next lifetime.
Right. See, that is the Tibetan Buddhist viewpoint. The Tibetan Buddhist viewpoint is that if you're unconscious, then you're going to be drawn to the lowest common denominator when you seek rebirth, because you're not going to recognize or differentiate illusion from reality. Mm-hmm. And I think by exploring a lot of these kind of inner spiritual realms in this way, the more familiar you become with navigating through these spiritual worlds, the better it's going to hold you instead when it comes time to find a new incarnation.
Well, you'll be able to recognize it, and you'll be able to say, aha, this is something I need to pay attention to, and when you pay attention to it and put energy into it, it's going to blossom in new ways that perhaps it wouldn't have otherwise.
One can only hope.
Yeah. Now,
one can only hope that that's the case.
Do you think that reincarnation involves us staying within our species? Do you think that that's...
Not necessarily, because I don't think humanity originated on the Earth myself.
Right. Okay. You think they were brought here elsewhere? Yeah.
Well, yeah. The DNA. I've studied the DNA. I've studied DNA extensively, and there are just some very interesting factors, like the DNA molecule that they've extracted from rock that's 3 billion years old, like the first bacteria. The DNA is almost identical to modern human DNA. It's almost exactly the same. 99.9%. And the reason for that being that there hasn't been any evolution of DNA, because it's the same DNA that was around in the first place.
So then, do you think that we were brought here, or that we evolved from here?
Well, it's a complicated question. I've written a book called The Divine Plot about that, which is only now available as an ebook through me. But it's a very difficult and thorny idea, and I'm not really sure, to be honest. I have some theories, but I don't really know. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. Maybe you can come back in your next lifetime and tell us if you got a little more experience at that point.
A good one, Chris.
Yeah, I've always thought that if I had to come back, I'd like to come back as my dog, because he certainly has a very easy life. But and I love dogs. But and I often wonder about the crossing over into the different lines of animals and stuff like that, and how we would come back.
I don't think it's out of the question that if people had, a lot of people find it much easier to be around other animals than they do around people.
I would argue now. You got my vote there.
So it would stand to reason the next time around they might come back as a dog. Maybe they would love that.
Yeah, it is interesting. So the concept of reincarnation is obviously it can be a touchy subject with some religious groups because it gets into sort of going against their dogma. But what we're talking about here is the idea of the soul evolving over the course of time. And the idea would be that as you pass from one frequency, meaning the material, carnal life that we live on a daily basis here, to when we pass on to a different lifetime, and our frequency changes at the time of death, we would be reincarnated as a new soul and therefore move on from there. Now, the idea of that is that when you come back as a new soul, you do come back. At what point in time would you think that would happen, Ted?
Well, I think it varies. I think you might come back 2,000 years ago, or you might come back next month, or you might be here right now. Steiner doesn't discount the possibility that you can have simultaneous existences that are around right at the present moment. Maybe
so
that's
you're saying
what
that you could come back. You could be reincarnated to somebody 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, because it's not linear. Eternity is not linear. There's no past, present, and future in eternity.
Yeah,
that's why they call it eternity.
And there's time, and the time is not.
When you incarnate, you enter this kind of linear. You enter this kind of linear dynamic, which we call time. It's like the old joke that God invented time so that everything didn't happen at once.
Yeah,
which would be very confusing. But I really do think that time goes backwards and forwards in the same way that I actually wouldn't mind going back into history.
Yeah, as long as they had good medicine, I think I'd be okay.
Well, they might or they may not. Maybe it requires that you have better health.
Yeah, that's what I'm sure it would be. I mean, it is a fascinating concept, the idea of time travel. I've never really subscribed to the idea of going back so much as I can see going forward and evolving. I'd have to give some more thought to the idea of going back, although I wouldn't be opposed to it.
Maybe going back is evolving. Maybe we were more evolved in the past than we are now.
Well, when you look at some of the architecture and you look at and the art that was created and stuff like that, you would almost, it's a very clear argument that things and what was being created back then is far more profound and evolved than what we're creating today. Just look at one cathedral in Europe, and you'll say, "My gosh, this is
absolutely."
Definitely, yeah,
I agree with that completely.
Yeah, I mean that's really clear.
I don't necessarily think that things are getting better. In fact, I think we're having a catastrophic impact on the planet.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think that the quality of what we're creating as artists is not quite of the same realm. And you can argue this could be another whole show in itself. But the idea of art evolving, where do we go with that? And that's another whole concept altogether.
No, I agree. That's a fascinating discussion. Well, a lot of these reincarnation ideas bring up exactly those kinds of discussions.
Yeah, it's really it's a wonderful topic. My guest today has been Tad Mann, and his website is www.atmann.net, not .com, .net. Make sure you put the NET. You can always Google him as well as TAD Mann, MANN, and get to his website there as well. He's the author of numerous books on astrology and all sorts of metaphysics, and he is currently writing a program for Tarot.com, which will be launching hopefully within the next month or so. And it's going to be a fascinating topic, a fascinating report that you can go online and buy, which will allow you to see your past life based on your birth chart. I think you'll find it very accurate, and I think you'll be some very familiar information in there. We do have to wrap up. Tad, I want to thank you very much for coming on. This is my 80th show, and since you were my first show, I didn't realize this when I asked you to come on, but it's some sort of a milestone of sorts, so I'm glad you're able to come on. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and I find you to be a real true visionary and a great honor to have you on today. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Chris. I look forward to coming back and talking with you.
We will. We know we've got more to talk about, so we're not done. So thanks, everyone, for listening, and you've been listening to Turning of the Wheel, and as always, be open to possibilities. As I mentioned to you earlier, I've got all my shows are podcasts. If you go to the iTunes Store and look up my name, in the iTunes Store, you'll be able to download all these episodes for free and have them on your iPod or anywhere you want to and listen to all this great information. There's an awful lot of wonderful information here with these wonderful guests that I have on who are really leading visionaries in thought. So I appreciate you very much listening. Again, this was my 80th show. I'm shooting for 100 and beyond, so stick with me and keep supporting me. Send those cards and letters in, and I'll talk to you next week. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to Turning of the Wheel with your host, Chris Flisher. To schedule a reading with me or to order artwork, you may visit my website at www.chrisflisher.com. That's www.chrisflisher.com. Or email me, and you can call me at 978-264-0668. Thank you. And as always, be open to possibilities.